Hey everybody, TacticAngel here, back on the PlayStation, and World of Warships Legends. We're here to run down another premium ship. This time, it's the USS Oklahoma, a Tier 4 premium American battleship. For this review, I'll start with history, as usual, then talk about the ship in-game, your commander choices, stats, and consumables. Then we'll finish off with a bit of gameplay. I have left some time codes down in the description if you do want to jump around. The USS Oklahoma was the second and last ship laid down as part of the Nevada class of dreadnought battleships of the United States Navy. The Nevada class was notable because it was the first of the American battleship classes, and indeed the first class of battleships in the world, to feature the all-or-nothing philosophy in battleship design. What this essentially meant is that the ship's belt would only cover the vital parts of the ship, and the extremities, like the bow and the stern, which could largely be blown away from the ship without causing catastrophic damage, were left relatively unprotected. While not a totally novel concept, this began a building tradition in the United States Navy that would last until the end of battleship production. Laid down in October 1912, launched in March 1914, and commissioned into service in May of 1916, the Oklahoma was a ship that never really got to show her full potential. Having been completed in 1916, she was built early enough to have participated in World War I, at least time-wise. Logistical concerns, namely the availability of oil in Britain, kept her from participating in the Grand Fleet early enough in the war to do much of anything. By comparison, less advanced ships, like the New York and Texas, which comprised the class immediately before the Nevadas, were able to fight alongside the Royal Navy fleet for quite a bit longer because they featured coal boilers. Oklahoma only made it to Great Britain in 1918, but other than a single uneventful convoy escort, she was unable to participate in the war in any major sense. After the war, the Oklahoma moved into the Pacific, where she would spend the rest of her life. Here she would participate in fleet exercises and put in for a major overhaul. Sadly, the Oklahoma's first brush with danger would pretty much be her last. On December 7, 1941, the Oklahoma was part of Battleship Row, just next to Maryland and just behind the West Virginia. This put her in the more vulnerable outside position. When the Japanese sneak attack commenced, she was immediately targeted by torpedo bombers, and she would be struck twice by torpedoes in the first few moments of the battle, both around amidships. Though those torpedo hits didn't cause any critical damage, they did shred the torpedo defense right where the ship could least afford to be heavily damaged. So when the ship was struck a third time and around the same place, there was nothing to dampen the energy of that hit. Water poured into the boiler rooms, and so began the tragedy of the Oklahoma. Though most of the crew was able to escape, with many of them climbing aboard the Maryland and helping to operate her AA mounts, hundreds of men were trapped within the ship. Upon the attack, unless your action station was on the deck, like with an AA crew, you were trained to either get to your action stations or take refuge in the third level of the ship, which would ordinarily be below the waterline. That all changed though as the ship rolled over. The most indelible image of the Oklahoma is perhaps the smooth lines of its undamaged hull protruding from the water after it had capsized. After the third torpedo hit, she lost power and began to list. Hit 2 more times, and she would only take about 12 minutes to roll over. Most people might find it strange that the Oklahoma is actually the first ship whose history I remember learning about that had really struck me well enough that I'd remember most of it. And maybe for some it would be better to skip forward through the rest of this chapter because the rest of this is fairly depressing, but I want to talk about it because it's important to why I appreciate the service of people, particularly in the Navy. But in large part, the naval profession is a combination of routine, drill, and what I have been told is not an insignificant amount of boredom. When you're lucky, you put into somewhere pretty interesting and have a good time without drawing too much attention to yourself. When you're unlucky, then you generally find yourself in the kind of peril from which victory, speed, or good fortune are your only routes of escape. Usually when things don't go well, death happens pretty quickly for most. A good portion of the Arizona's crew, for instance, were simply there one moment and gone the next. But capsized in shallow water, that was not the case for the overturned Oklahoma. People began to hear tapping as trapped sailors tried to signal their position. What stuck with me was the thought of the sailors in total darkness within this wreck for days, and in equal parts, that feeling of helplessness or guilt that the rescue teams must have felt when either their acetylene torches ate up all the remaining oxygen within a compartment, or let all of the air out as the water rushed in behind it before they could get the survivors out. Over the coming days, these efforts would save the lives of 32 crewmen though, but in total, 429 of the 1,365 men aboard her would lose their lives in the attack. Just 35 of these bodies were identified before burial. Though perhaps overlooked, eventually the Oklahoma was rolled over. This happened in June of 1943, meaning she'd spent about a year and a half upside down. That's a bit of time to spend in salt water. Her hull had been drilled through several times, cut open in several places, and generally too deformed to be truly salvageable. And by this point, America would have some other modern battleships coming online. Her weapons were removed, and some would even see service on other ships. Parts of her superstructure were removed and sent to Oklahoma to serve as a memorial, but then she was sold for scrap in September 1944. More than 500 Oklahomans, including the governor of the state, traveled to California to honor the ship before she was to be broken up, but she would never make it back to port. A heavy storm came over her as she was being towed towards San Francisco. She was only about a quarter of the way there from Hawaii to the mainland. She began taking on water quickly and sank to the bottom, nearly taking with her the two tugs that were guiding her back to the continental United States. Her exact location is unknown, and until some underwater explorer searches out the wreck, that ends the tragic story of the Oklahoma ship herself. But for the crew of the Oklahoma, their story would pick up strangely in 2015, when the USS Oklahoma project was given permission to exhume the bodies of the unidentified Marines and sailors buried at Pearl. Over the next 6 years, DNA evidence has been used to identify all but 9 of the previously unidentified soldiers and sailors as of July 2021, with many of the men being returned finally to their home soil where they could be buried with honor. As for the Oklahoma in-game, she plays more or less like the Nevada. There's hardly enough difference between these two ships to really shake a stick at. The real advantage here is that this is a premium ship, of course, so she'll make you a little bit more coin if you do want to play tier 4 ships, and of course, she has a little bit better range than Nevada. For now, the Oklahoma is free for folks who complete the Star-Spangled Fleet Bureau mission, and anyone interested in getting her should at least try to start this Bureau project before it goes away. In other words, as soon as possible. But for those of you visiting us from the future, is she worth your money, assuming that she would be sold again? Well, that's probably going to depend on what money is worth to you. As of right now, this is the entire list of differences the Oklahoma has versus the Tech Tree Nevada, and I would say simply that you have a good opportunity to know what you're getting into if you do want to get her. If you want me to spell that out even further, do play the Nevada and then figure out if you think you'll like this ship. But if you want my one-sentence summary of this ship, it's a very slow ship, it hits hard, and has neither extremely good nor extremely poor survivability. As we head into commanders, I think the most common thing people enjoy doing with this ship is improving the range even further with sims. All of this plays pretty well into the Oklahoma's natural strengths, with the only major disadvantage being that just about the slowest ship in the game is going to get even slower, and that will probably limit you towards taking a position predictably towards the middle of the field. In defense of this choice, I will say you don't objectively slow down this ship that much since it's based on a percentage, but this may be the straw that breaks this particular camel's back for you. The other battleship commander, Willis Lee, is at least going to give you a real good chance of keeping your ship chugging along at a leisurely 20 or maybe higher knots. I didn't find anything particularly wrong with playing this ship like this because anything with 5 heals can easily be an asset simply by existing towards the end of the game. But offensive firepower is definitely much more of a spray and pray scenario here. I'm not sold on the Oklahoma as a brawler, specifically in using the skill brawler plus Porcupine, but other than a few German ships, this is probably the most viable ship that you could try this with at Tier 4. Just be warned that your turret traverse is probably going to make this not really work all that well for you after your first or second shot. Dewey is a possibility, but probably one that you are being forced into rather than one that you choose for yourself. For most, this means a reasonable improvement in speed, turret traverse, and range if you want to use this. But I will briefly draw attention to the Oklahoma's really good concealment and point out that this is, at least mathematically possible, to get your concealment down to something in the 10.5 kilometer range or lower. Ordinarily, I find the idea of smuggling a battleship into those sorts of ranges to be kind of hilariously funny and often useful, but smuggling a ship this slow anywhere is something that I think you'll find hard to do. As we talk about stats, we'll talk about where the Nevada and Oklahoma fall in terms of Tier 4 battleships, but I will also point out the few places where these ships differ. The Nevada-class battleships are pretty standard as far as survivability is concerned. Having within 1,000 points of the average, your armor value profile is nothing incredible, offering you the normal set of vulnerable bow and stern plates that will be overmatched by pretty much every battleship you're likely to face. The side of this ship does look weak from the outside picture, but this is really just the robust torpedo bulge, which actually helps to hide two very notable defenses. The first is a thick armor belt. It's not uniformly thick though, but every inch of this can bounce everything that you're likely to face when appropriately angled. Then you have an uncommon feature on American ships, a turtleback. At close and medium ranges, this will give you a substantial protection against citadels, though at long range, the protection this offers you is fairly negligible. This protects a reasonably well-armored citadel, particularly since you'll likely have to get through several layers of armor under most circumstances. The most notable deficiency in her armor protection is the aftward citadel protection, which is just inside of the poorly armored stern section of the ship. In other words, this ship does function a little bit better while driving towards the enemy than it does while kiting away from it, particularly if you're dealing with battleship shells. The Oklahoma has the same odd arrangement of 10 14-inch guns that the Nevada has. This is accomplished with one 3-gun turret and one 2-gun turret facing both the front and the back of the ship. Though the Nevada has the shortest range battleship guns at Tier 4 with just 14.6, the Oklahoma can shoot a respectable 15.1, which makes her a little more long-reaching than average. The reload on these guns is nothing incredible at just 34 seconds, and though it looks brutally painful, this 60-second turret traverse is the most common value that you'll find on Tier 4 battleships. You pay for this extra range with just a little bit less damage for your HE and AP. This is going to be 100 points of damage versus the Nevada on high explosives, with a 3% lower fire chance and 300 damage on AP shells. Overall, the difference here is hardly noticeable though, and is a trait I would probably say benefits the Oklahoma. You share the exact same secondary arrangement as the Nevada, which is a reasonable collection of guns, though with its relatively low range, I would kind of question whether or not you'd actually want to build into this. It's not the most unreasonable thing to do, but just be warned, if you did want to do this, you might as well just play the Nevada, since you're going to have slightly better damage at the ranges where these secondary guns are going to matter. Neither the Nevada nor Oklahoma are exactly powerful AA platforms. They both have pretty average AA for the tier, though the Oklahoma does have a slightly weaker AA battery, which is basically because she has so little medium range damage, where the Nevada has just a little bit more here. In any case, there's only one ship with a scary AA suite at this tier, and that is of course the USS Texas, and CV players will probably do just fine launching attacks against you in either the Nevada or the Oklahoma. Where maneuverability is concerned, the Nevada and Oklahoma are the slowest battleships at the tier, but since the previous two slowest battleships were the New York and Texas, you'll probably know what you're getting into with an American battleship. You have a pretty tight 610 meter turning circle, but that's not uncommon for brutally slow ships. This 13.1 second rudder shift is just average, and overall, unless there's a lot of room between you and the thing launching torpedoes at you, it's probably going to hit you. For whatever reason, the Nevada and Oklahoma are pretty stealthy ships, at least as far as battleships concerned. They start with the same base concealment, which is 12.9, but here you can see what it is with camo applied. This is 500 meters less than average. That advantage drops to just 300 meters if we're talking about being spotted by aircraft, but when firing her guns from smoke, she's more noticeable than average. Overall, I'm not sure this is a thing that you're likely to exploit, but it is a possibility, so just letting you know. And as an American battleship, a standard battleship class, you have the exact standard setup for a Tier 4 battleship. After your damage control, you're going to have 3 heals with the normal 0.5% per second for 28 seconds and an 80-second reload. Then you have a choice between either plane or a secondary targeting consumable. The smart money is probably on exploiting the decent range and accuracy of the Oklahoma. Picking up that spotter plane will allow you to better exploit the advantage at medium and long range. My second choice here would probably be the fighter. It's a stronger choice when CVs are in the meta, but worst case scenario, it would allow you to see over islands and smoke screens a bit. Though the secondary suite on the Nevada and Oklahoma is pretty good, it's fairly short ranged. I'm not sure this really saves you from a suicidal destroyer very often, given the range, but if you do want to choose this, you'll definitely get a lot more out of this choice than you would if you put the same sort of consumable on either the New York or Texas, where they unfortunately do not get the choice of a plane. So we'll get into some gameplay here, and we're going to be on Archipelago. You will notice as this game starts up that this is not a full game. This was loaned to me during the first week of the update, so it was kind of hard to get into any game that featured, I don't know, more than 3 people. So we'll go ahead and put our commander up on the screen. As you can see, we are using the secondary modification, which is maybe a little bit inconsistent with the fact I've picked a fighter aircraft, and clearly I'm concerned about aircraft carriers ruining my games. So in any case, I make strange decisions sometimes, and I was throwing on different stuff on and off of this ship just to kind of see what kind of differences it really made. This is pretty much, though, your standard accuracy sort of situation, and this is really what I think most people are going to enjoy playing this ship for. The choices that I'm making right now is I'm kind of going towards the middle of the map, because particularly with American standard class battleships, if you decide to take the outside route on a map, and let's say no one else does, then you're going to spend a lot of time not getting to do anything, maybe the entire match. Speaking of doing things, though, what just happened to that Furitaka is exactly what people like to do with these sorts of battleships, and you can see in this low level setting, the map's small enough that if I'm moving towards the middle of the map, I'm going to be able to keep my guns in the fight for as long as possible. Now, I am pretty sure that there is a destroyer that's going to come over here, because you can see that little shadow on the map. And wouldn't you know it, it's a V-170. Kind of one of the dangers of moving into an area of the map which is likely to be populated by destroyers. Now, the V-170 does have those nifty forward-firing torpedoes, and my guess is that he fired it kind of towards the line where it was predicted my ship would be. We've done a little bit of moderation of our speed, and now we can start turning back into the torpedo to try to get our guns around. Gyrating drill bits do help quite a bit here in terms of making the turret rotation livable, I want to say, but it's still pretty slow. This is one reason as a brawler that this might be kind of an awkward ship to try to run. Now we're just praying that we get our guns reloaded so we can get a couple extra shots out there on the V-170. And there you go, that's what you get. We've taken him out, which is great because he had a real chance of posing a significant threat. And obviously, if he didn't do me in, then probably this island would. I guess the one nice thing about being brutally slow is most brutally slow ships do have decent turning radiuses, and we do manage to dodge that island. Looking out there at the Wyoming, this would be an excellent time to have a spotter plane. But we do manage to do a little bit of damage in spite of our maybe less than perfect accuracy. Real nice chunky hit there. We leave him on almost nothing, and now it looks like player 2 has entered the match. Now we're doing our level best to try to make sure to pose a difficult target for torpedoes. We get a little bit lucky on the gap there. I think that guy was probably shooting some widespreads, and so our pretty good turning radius, even though none of our other maneuverability statistics are really helping there, get us out of the way. Just trying to wait to line up these rear guns on that Jaguar. We fire the guns, but we've killed him with skill first. So down he goes, and we managed to roll past a high caliber, which is pretty fancy. I'm looking at my choice of targets here. Furitaka is the best choice. The thing about shooting at the Furitaka is it's doing what some people might refer to as border assisted dodging. This makes it a little bit difficult to hit it because there's kind of a visual disconnect between where the ship is actually going and where you're supposed to be aiming and what speed it's even traveling at, because if you're going 30 miles an hour into a brick wall, you're actually not going anywhere. Obviously the border is going to angle you. Don't think about this too hard. For better or worse, that's more or less what I have managed to accomplish in this particular game. It's a pretty quick game. It was pretty decisive. And while this is wrapping up, I will just say I really love the camouflage on this ship. And as a history guy, you look at this and you're like, I don't understand why the Americans have these funky colored turrets. And that's actually to help with aerial identification of each one of the ships. So this camo pattern is indicating that the Oklahoma was the third battleship in Battleship Division 1, meaning she would have been sailing around out there with the Arizona and Nevada. In any case, the game has ended. It's time for me to talk about my closing thoughts on this particular boat. And what can I say? This is a standard class battleship. It's hard to say that a ship you can earn for free isn't worth it. It definitely is. And it's a really great thing when wargaming makes this kind of content available to players. So that's good stuff. If you're looking at this versus the Texas, if you have the chance to buy them in the future, that's a little bit more hard to say. The Texas has a forte that is really, really useful when there are so many aircraft carriers out there like there are right now. Otherwise, the Oklahoma is probably fairly competitive, if not slightly better than the Texas as a gunnery platform. But like I said, this is a standard class battleship, and you probably know if you like this kind of ship or not, since we have at this point like a half dozen examples of the various different classes. So yeah, she's gonna play a lot like those boats. Really helpful observation there, I know. In any case, I hope this review was helpful for you guys, and as always, I'll see you on the next one.